Hello, Internet. Welcome to the show. Today we're going to be talking about the idea of, is the Ice Age a myth? Is it completely a figment of our imagination? Now, bear with me. You might think that sounds crazy, like the Ice Age. Are you kidding me? It's established. It's settled science. It's an established fact. Um, well, hear me out. So I know there's the Pixar Ice Age trilogy out there. I know that you can't you can't open up a popular science magazine or Discover magazine or Science magazine that doesn't have one, two, or three articles talking about some new discovery about the Ice Age. And but that does not mean it really happened. So for the longest time, I used to think the Ice Age was connected to the flood. So whether you are reading alternative history, I happen to have been reading Graham Hancock's work Underworld, and he talks about when the Ice Age was ending and winding down. The ice sheets were melting, and there was a couple like catastrophic collapses of ice sheets, and these meltwater pulses occurred at different intervals, and they rapidly raised water levels in coastal areas where civilizations had developed, and this was the source of these flood myths. And I believe Hancock had pinpointed the second one as being both the biblical deluge and the one Plato described that inundated Atlantis, and this was around 10,000 BC or so, around in there. There was one several thousand years before that, and one several thousand years after that, and so I was like, okay, that makes sense, right? The flood is intimately tied with the Ice Age. And I'd been open to the idea of multiple floods, even though the Bible only describes one flood. Other cultures, like the Greek culture, they had three different flood myths. So Plato talked about these cyclical floods happening. So I was like, okay, this is this flood cycle. And then later on, I'd been reading some flood geology books by some creationist authors, and they don't have multiple floods, but they have one flood, and then the Ice Age is the consequence of that. So after the flood, there's so much moisture and a rapid cooling of the planet that it causes these glacier sheets to happen. So no matter which kind of genre of articles, your books you are reading, the Ice Age is intimately tied with the idea of a flood. Now, the flood is appealing simply because every culture describes it. Like you can't. There's at least 500 different, cultures independently describing, the Earth became, mankind had become wicked, and mankind had angered the gods or God, and as punishment, the flood was sent to wipe mankind out. And one righteous family survives and repopulates the planet afterwards, and repopulates animal life afterwards also, that are preserved upon a boat or an ark or some type of watercraft. That's everywhere. That is part of our collective history. And I really, for me, I was never comfortable with somebody thousands of years later saying, your people's history is just made up figments of their imagination. Like, these things never happened. I was never comfortable with dismissing myths of cultures by people so far after the fact. Like, that to me was just like, it would be tantamount to, me flying to some other continent, to some remote village where the tribal leader is describing their history to me, and these people have lived there for thousands and thousands of years, and they believed that, these certain things, whether, like, let's say mythological animals, or whether they have, stories of floods. For me to say, well, I don't think so, like, that's all well and good, but you might believe these things, and your people might have believed these things for thousands and thousands of years, but I know better. Like, that to me is just so arrogant. There's just this level of arrogance that I've never been comfortable with that. So, and you also have to factor in, it isn't necessarily arrogance, but there is, since the Wars of Reformation, which, occurred, during the Protestant Reformation in Europe, Europe was torn apart by these internal, Catholic Protestant wars, and like the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War, and like for hundreds of years, Europe was, torn. The fabric of Europe was torn apart by religious wars. So that's where atheism got this foothold. It's like, well, we don't like all this war that's going on over the name of religion. So atheism, gets this foothold in European culture because of that. So that's why, when you're hearing like the scientific community or the modern scientists and historians saying there's absolutely no evidence for the flood, they're a little biased when they say that. Like, there is in academia this anti-religious bias that has grown out of the Wars of Reformation. Some people just think it's been oversimplified as, it was all about Galileo, and that's why science hates religion. It was a lot more, there's a lot more to it than just Galileo that caused this, this anti-religious bias that permeates modern Western academia. So for those two reasons, I've always been open to the flood, but I always thought the flood was connected to the Ice Age intimately. Like, I thought it either came out of the Ice Age happened because of the flood, or the Ice Age melting caused multiple floods, one or the other. And then I read this theory that had a completely different take on that. And but before we get into that, I also have to explain that one of the other reasons for discounting the flood had to do with the lack of flood water. Like, where in order for the globe to be inundated, which is what is required to need an ark. If you just have local floods, or you just raise the ocean levels halfway up a mountainside, well, you don't need an ark. To inundate the highest mountain points and to necessitate an ark or a boat of some kind, you need 8 times the total amount of water that's in the oceans. Where did that water come from, and where did that water go? So since there was no answer to that, it was just assumed that, okay, there just must not have been a flood. It just must be a myth. Well, what explains all the 500 different cultures? Well, maybe it's just Jungian archetypes in our subconscious, because we all started out as a fetus floating in the amniotic fluids of our mother's womb. So maybe that's where, that's a stretch. That all these cultures are describing like similar stories about boats and the angering of the gods or God by mankind. That's all just unconscious memories of being in the womb as a fetus? Okay. Well, so they found the water. Like, the crust is a relatively thin part of our planet, but beneath that is a very thick layer of mantle, and there's the upper mantle and the lower mantle, and then this transition zone in between. In the transition zone and in the lower mantle, they have found oceans of water locked in these rocks. They're like hydrogen and oxygen fit perfectly in these crystal lattices of these minerals that are in these areas of the deep within the mantle and transition zone. And when you heat them, water comes out. And they found 5 oceans worth of water in I want to say the lower mantle, and 3.5 oceans worth in the transition zone. And I might have those flipped around the amounts might be reversed there. But nonetheless, you've got 8.5 oceans worth of water estimated to be locked deep within the planet. And rabbinical commentaries say that during the flood, the windows of heaven were opened and the fountains of the deep were broken open. And in the rabbinic, well, that's in the Bible itself, but in the rabbinic commentaries it says that the flood waters were heated in the pits of Sheol. Well, you need to heat the mantle. You need to heat those rocks that are in the transition zone in the lower mantle to get the water out of it, to get these oceans worth of water out of it. So now we've got the source of the water. And then I read this other article that was saying that since they had no, back in the day when they came up with the theory of the Ice Age, because they had no obvious source for the floodwaters, they had to explain all this geological evidence that was assumed to be evidence of the flood, such as the scablands of Washington, or these erratics where all these boulders are strewn across Europe, and these ripple fields and these drumlins, and so they're like, oh, this is all, they had originally thought this was all the product of a flood. But then when they couldn't find the floodwater, they had to have another theory of what could this be. And so all the geological evidence for the flood was reinterpreted, because they said, well, sometimes we see like these boulders strewn about up near the edges of glaciers, and sometimes we see these ripple fields up near the edges of glaciers. So maybe the glaciers must have been all the way down here, almost, touching these equatorial zones. So the ice sheets, these glaciers must have been all the way down there. That's how they came up with the Ice Age. It was literally necessary to explain the evidence that now that they discounted the flood because there's no source for the floodwaters, well, we got to have something else to explain all this geology. And they just popped in the Ice Age theory for that. So when you start looking at it, and for instance, one of the best examples for this is drumlins. Drumlins are these teardrop-shaped hills, and they've got these geological these layers, this strata, and they're shaped like teardrops, and they're supposedly sculpted by ice. They're sculpted by these ice sheets. Well, there were these two types of drumlins, and some were occurring. They were like called bedrock drumlins, and then there was this other type of drumlin. And they're like, well, why are we seeing the two? In the same fields, we're seeing two completely different types of drumlins going on, when we should either be seeing one or the other. So that was like the drumlin formation had always remained a mystery. Well, then they started saying, well, it actually wasn't sculpted by ice. It was actually sculpted by meltwater underneath the ice sheets. So now you've got these rivers underneath the ice sheets that are sculpting this. And we actually see these little mini drumlins near rivers that are formed specifically by water, hydraulic action alone. Well, if you've now taken away the idea of drumlins being formed by ice sheets, and now we're saying it's actually these subterranean rivers melting underneath the ice sheets, that's indistinguishable from a flood itself. Like, it's water doing one and water under ice doing the other. Like, the ice is all hypothetical on top of it. So you actually don't need drumlins to be explained by ice sheets. It can just be the flood. And apparently 95% of all the evidence for the Ice Age is better explained by a flood. Now, I'm officially now an Ice Age skeptic, and I don't believe there was an Ice Age. I think, now, don't get me wrong, there's ice cap, there's the polar ice caps, and those wax and wane a little bit, but they're not coming all the way down to equatorial regions, and there's no cultures that talk about these walls of ice, and there's nothing. It's all better explained as a flood. So make of that what you will. I'll put in the description some links to the book if you want to read some more about it, but pop into the comment section and let me know what you think. Thanks for tuning in.